Good evening, everybody. My name is Andrew Schaefer from Trafalgar. Welcome. Thank you for joining our March training webinar titled The Science and Art of Levy Collections. I'd just like to introduce our guests first before just covering a few housekeeping points as usual. Firstly, special welcome, and joining us again for a training webinar is Dylan Heerschop. Dylan is an attorney at Heerschop Pienaar Attorneys. He specializes in the law pertaining to community schemes and all the concomitant compliance issues. He has obtained a master's degree in estate planning law, giving him a keen insight into the financial aspects of community schemes. Dylan, thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to you speaking in a moment, and we greatly appreciate your expertise on this important subject. Also joining us are my colleagues Adele Reinecker and Rihanna Redlinghast, who are our National Collections Managers based in Johannesburg and Pretoria, respectively. As usual, our very able and consistent Karine Coetzee, who's Trafalgar's property management consultant nationally and looking after all of our community scheme teams, and Peter Menon, Director of Legal and Marketing at Trafalgar. So thank you all for being here and joining us on this webinar. Just some housekeeping. So firstly, all those that registered will be sent a recording link for the webinar as well as the slides. So no need to ask for those. Those will be sent out automatically. A reminder, we do load the webinar recording onto our training website, which is training.trafalgar.coza. All of the prior webinars are linked and loaded there, so the records are there for you to access. A reminder too of the chatbot tests, Trafalgar's electronic service system. We did mention that last time, but it is available. Bottom right, you will see the button. Any technical questions, anything at all you'd like to know about community schemes, owning and community schemes, roles of trustees and directors, please give it a try. We find it very helpful. There's also a link to connect to Karine if you need extra feedback, and there is a monitoring of the responses to make sure that we do measure those and they are of a high standard. So it certainly provides immediate self-service, and we hope it will be helpful in terms of performing roles as trustees and directors in particular. Please do raise any questions you might have in the Q&A. The rest of us will try and answer those while Dylan is speaking. And if we don't get to all the questions, we will certainly try and respond afterwards and make sure that those are covered. Right at the end, you'll see names and contact details for the panel, and you're more than welcome to make contact with us with any questions you've got, and we'll certainly do our best to answer those. We can also schedule an online meeting and try and review any particular circumstances that require a more detailed response. So please feel free to use those contact details. We are here to help, we're here to advise, and we're here just to really share knowledge in the interests of community scheme governance and management effectiveness. This is an important topic. It's one that's close to the hearts and minds of many trustees and directors, and it ranges from an irritant to severely stressful and disruptive in community schemes, depending on the circumstances, and certainly it can impact and disrupt cash flow, which causes service delivery pressure in many community schemes. All the economic pressures we hear about, the disruptions in the Middle East now, do tend to play out as economic pressure on owners of sectional title and homeowner schemes. That does then, aggravate levy arrears, and so the process escalates. Today, we're going to focus particularly on legal collections because we hear very often as a managing agent that legal collections are very slow, they're very expensive, results seem to take very long to achieve, and it's not very obvious or clear why. So tonight we've got Dylan, who's going to take us through the legal steps that are required, the rules of court, why it does take so long. And I think when you see the process and the steps that are required and the turnaround times that are very often either a function of rules of court or caseload in the various courts, it will be clearer why the process is so long, but nevertheless, it is what we have to work with in terms of legal collections. Dylan will give some, advice on better approaches or workarounds or, factors to take into account, because there are different scenarios depending on how the cases play out. But we hope tonight that you'll find it insightful in terms of the legal process that's applicable to arrear levy collections. So last point is there will be a pop-up survey at the end. If you've got a few seconds just to complete it, we do appreciate your feedback, and in particular, any suggestions of topics you'd like us to cover with the monthly training webinars ahead. So once again, welcome everyone. Thank you to my colleagues, and Dylan, over to you.
Hi, Andrew and team. Thank you very much for the opportunity tonight. Thank you to everyone who took the time to attend it. Obviously, levy collections can more often than not be a bugbear for community schemes. And it's important for us as scheme executives and managing agents to understand exactly, the ins and outs pertaining to levy collections, and oftentimes to try and empathize with the frustration and the timelines that we also sit with as attorneys. Obviously, we wanted to go quicker oftentimes, but sometimes the court rules really do not allow for us to do things quicker. That being said, as Andrew mentioned, we're going to look at the Q&A. Andrew, Brianna, and Adele will be in the background, so please post any questions in the Q&A. So just as an introduction, and I think this is a very profound statement that I may make, but the advent of arrear levies have increased significantly in recent years. At our firm, we pride ourselves on looking at statistics and, almost getting a behind the scenes understanding of what needs to happen. So in 2019, we reached out to a few of our agents that we do work for, and we asked them, out of the levies that you guys raise, on average, what do we look at, percentage-wise, levies not being paid? So in 2019, the averages that we received was between 8 and 9% of the levies that we raised came to not being paid. We did the same exercise last year, and to our shock and awe, we saw that these percentages increased to between 23 and 25%, which means in certain schemes, this means a quarter of the levies that we raise are not being paid. And from that perspective, it becomes important to understand that managing levy collections and arrears is probably the most important role that scheme executives will have. And the whole point of tonight's discussion is just to empower scheme executives to understand how we combat these increases. So as a starting point, we need to understand, and as the name may suggest, in the beginning there were levies. So normally when I'd have this discussion, we looked at various items: credit control policies, compliant community scheme administration, soft collections, payday psychology, and out-of-court settlements. The benefit that you guys have is being managed by Trafalgar, one of the best, if not the best, managing agent in South Africa. So from that perspective, these things from a soft collections perspective has already been properly dealt with. And the idea of tonight's discussion is to zoom into the official handover and when the attorneys will start becoming involved. So the starting point, and one of the ideas that I want to emphasize, is that great handovers prevent greater litigation. Sometimes I get the perception that, the general public believe that attorneys are magicians and, that they can pull a rabbit out of a hat. But more often than not, our collections is as strong as the weakest link. So one of these pain points is brought forward balances. It's a difficult thing to prove. The moment the registrars, the judges, or the magistrates, or even CSOS adjudicators see these types of things, we will have difficulty in collecting it. Another one is interest, and specifically when we look at interest, it's interest being raised without the interest resolution. How, does one expect in these circumstances for an attorney to collect? Legal fees is another bugbear. Incomplete or contradictory documents. So I've seen a handover where managing agent A's closing balance is 10,000 Rand, and then the new managing agent's opening balance is 15,000 Rand. Obviously, there's nothing in between explaining the sudden jump, and with these types of things, it makes the collection process extremely difficult. Something else that I need to mention about handovers that is important to us, and we suggest that these types of documents also be provided to attorneys, is promises to pay. I believe there's a lot of golden emails from a litigation perspective. Any email where an owner says, I acknowledge, I know I owe the money, I'm sorry, and for whatsoever reason, I can't pay at this point. These things are really important when we look at the handover. And as I said, the collection is unfortunately as strong as the weakest link. So let's go into the ideal handover. So what do attorneys need for a bulletproof collection? Firstly, a fully detailed statement from zero balance, or as close as possible that we can get it to the zero balance. Obviously, I understand in certain circumstances, we don't have a situation where we have the benefit of fully detailed statements, but then we need to get as close as possible. Governance documents is important. Your MOI, conduct rules, management rules, constitutions, these types of things need to be shared with attorneys. Resolutions, when we look at interest and these types of resolutions, it's important to convey those resolutions to the attorneys. And then probably the most important component of what we require is defensible AGM packs for the duration of the claim. If we are not in a position to prove that we've had compliant AGMs where we've compliantly approved budgets and we've compliantly apportioned those budgets to the respective owners, it is quite a difficult task for an attorney to get that claim. And then something as well, enforceable claim amounts. Again, legal fees, it's a big bugbear. If those types of amounts are on statements, it's difficult to collect it. In Duplum rule, when it comes to interest, where your interest cannot exceed the capital amount. So for example, if we are in the month of March and your capital pure levy amount is 50,000 on the statement, the interest that we raise in terms of that should also not exceed 50,000. You can never have a situation where your capital exceeds your interest. Prescription is another problem. If the levies have prescribed, it's difficult to enforce it. And then also fines, when we look at fines and the enforcement thereof, we need to understand that we have to follow the compliant process. The necessary substantive and procedural fairness needs to apply in order to enable an attorney to successfully collect it. So I want to re-emphasize the statement that I made in the previous slide. The collection is as strong as your weakest link. So it's important that when we attend to a handover, that we ensure that the amounts that we hand over is not just a blank check that we've written in our mind and an expectation that we've created, but we need to understand in certain circumstances, we need to also empower our attorneys to ensure that we have a bulletproof collection process. Then the commencement of the collection process, just a bit on the process. We start with pre-litigation, which would be a statutory or a final demand. Obviously, there's a lot of layers to this onion. Before it gets to the attorneys, we will also have Trafalgar doing their own soft collections and trying to ensure that payment occurs. And then the step from the attorneys, which would be the statutory or the final demand. The next step would be institution of legal action. So this could be your CSOS form to lodge a dispute. It could be a summons, and that is how one would then now institute the legal action. The next step would be judgment phase. So there's three different variables from a judgment perspective. The first one is default judgment, which means the owner has not defended the matter, and we can apply for a judgment in their absence or in the absence of an opposition that was received. The other two pertains to defended matters. So with a summary judgment, what it means is it's a shortcut trial, basically, which means that let's say an owner defends the matter, but they don't really provide a defense to the claim. They don't say, for example, the budgets were not compliantly approved or those things which may be a triable issue. Then we look at a summary judgment, which is in essence a shortcut judgment. And then if all else fails and we have to go to trial, then it would be trial. And I mean, from your guys' perspective, this is what we see in the movies where there's a person in the witness stand and there's oral evidence being led. So those are the options when a community scheme gets to the point of having to obtain judgment. Then managing your attorneys. I think it's important to convey that we need to understand that scheme administration is still a business. So an example that I like to use, trustees oftentimes are in, corporate businesses where they understand structures, labor law, for example, but then these trustees come home and they fire the gardener without following due process. So we need to understand that as a juristic entity, as a community scheme, sometimes we have to look at scheme administration in terms of a business. As much as it is a business, you need to understand that you are allowed to ask attorneys for a KPI to manage their timelines. So to give you a bit of an idea of a KPI, this is HP Inc.'s KPI, but it's just so that you can understand exactly how you can try and manage an attorney's progress. So from our perspective, we've got 1 calendar day to obtain the instruction and to review the documents. Thereafter, on the 2nd consecutive day, we have to send out the letter of demand and contact the owner. Then there is a 14-day waiting period. For bodies corporate, in terms of prescribed management rule 25, we have to give them 14 days. The reason why there's an asterisk is for HOAs, it's not necessarily any specific period, it's a reasonable period, but we also suggest 14 days just so that you can also enable the attorney to do a bit of soft collections during this period. We see a lot of matters being settled at this point, where if you make positive contact with the debtors, you can try and get it settled. So for example, we have 2 follow-ups after the letter during this 14-day period, where we then email and try and telecom the owner again. I mean, ultimately, from our perspective, the idea is to get the money in as quick as possible. After that, we confirm non-payment, and we then ask for instruction to draft a summons. We give ourselves 3 days to do that, and then we look at delivering the summons to be issued, issuing the summons at court. Again, there's an asterisk next to the 7. Certain jurisdictions have other requirements, certain ones. So for example, most of the high courts, you issue it on court online, which means in the comfort of my office, I upload the document onto the court's electronic platform, and it gets issued within a half an hour or an hour. So the timelines there is a bit sticky because it depends on the jurisdiction that you would now issue action from. Then delivering the summons to the sheriff, and then service of summons. So we're not going to run through the whole of HP's KPI, but the understanding and the thing that I want to implore on you guys is where the work lies with the attorney. We all know the courts are slow. We all know the sheriffs are slow. Those are the attorney's best excuses. So the point of the matter is where the file is on the attorney's desk, drafting a summons, drafting a letter of demand. It's with those timelines that we need to ensure that we manage our attorneys, because there the progress and the timelines is in direct control by the attorney. So the moment it gets to the court, it's a different story, but we need to really hone in as scheme executives and ensure that we manage the timelines of our attorneys, especially where the periods are within their own control. Then probably the first roadblock that we could possibly hit in the collection process is a return of non-service, which means the sheriff is unable to serve the owner in terms of the court rules. So what now? Obviously, the court rules have certain expectations of us when trying to serve. You need to be older than 16 at the premises and a responsible person, and the sheriff needs to make certain attempts before simply trying to place a copy at the property that he's trying to serve. So your solution is, if there's inefficient service, the scheme must bring an application for substituted service, which in essence means we are going to the courts telling them we are unable to serve on this particular owner. Can you please direct us as to how we should effect service? So when can you apply for it? So this is again a firm secret or part of our strategy. So we suggest you should at least try to serve the document twice at the particular property. And it would be even better if one of those attempts are after hours or over the weekend. Thereafter, we can then look towards applying for substituted service. How will service occur after this? As the attorney drafting the application, you will ask for specific relief and tell the court how they should possibly direct us to serve. It still remains within the direction of the court, but our suggestion would be that you ask for service via email. In this day and age, we do have the benefit of having a debtor's email and possibly looking at telling the sheriff to deliver a copy or to affix a copy at the premises itself. We can get orders where the judges ask for us to publish in local newspapers. We've even had a judge giving an order saying that you have to publish it on the 7 o'clock news. They have to, whilst reading the 7 o'clock news on SABC, they need to tell, the public of this. So obviously, all of these things have cost components, and that is why we normally propose to our clients that we ask for service via email because it doesn't cost anything. But if the judges or the magistrates are so inclined, they may ask for service by way of a government publication in a government gazette or in a local newspaper. How does this affect your timelines? I'm going to show you now a bit of a timeline that we've compiled. So when can we expect a monetary judgment? We had the discussion where we ran through pre-litigation, institution of the action, and then finally getting to judgment. So we took a look at our firm statistics for the past 2 years to try and calculate some sort of a expectation that you guys may have. So the first type of judgment is judgment by default. So as I've mentioned, this means the owner never defended the matter, and we had the benefit of applying for judgment in the absence of such opposition. So from our handovers from inception, so this means we got the handover from letter of demand, one can look at about roughly 11 to 14 weeks. So basically just under 4 months, we can look at a judgment from instruction to getting the judgment. We've also seen from inherited files where we didn't get the instructions from the start. Then one can also look at 900 to 300 plus days. So it can get long if we don't manage it properly. And these statistics clearly show the difference. Then from a summary judgment perspective, if it's unopposed, so the debtor has defended, we have brought an application for summary judgment because we've told them they don't have a defense, and the owner does not then also oppose the summary judgment application, we're looking at about 5 to 6 months. So it's an extra 2 months as opposed to a judgment by default, which is just under 4 months. We're looking at 5 to 6 months now. But then again, if it's not properly managed, we can look towards 170 to 500 plus days. We've really seen some shocking files from our colleagues, and that again emphasizes the need for us to properly manage the workflow and the progress of these matters. From a summary judgment perspective, if it's opposed, so the owner has opposed the summary judgment as well, we're looking at about 10 to 11 months to try and address this. This is going to be the shocker, so ladies and gentlemen, please drink the blood pressure medication now. When we look at a trial, and this is quite a crazy spread, 18 to 84 months. It's difficult to say that's an average, but the unfortunate reality is we must understand that there's a lot of different jurisdictions and there's a lot of different times where different types of courts are more busy or less busy, and this creates this huge parity or polarity between trials that can be quick, but trials that can also take an extensive amount of time. So, for example, when one looks at trial dates for Johannesburg at this point, the moment we've finished all of our documents, and that is already a big process, then we're looking at about 3 years from date of application for the trial until we get a trial date. The Pretoria people, close your ears now. From a Pretoria perspective, if we apply for a date today, we're looking at a trial date in 5 years' time. So, and these are for the High Courts. So in these circumstances, you can clearly see there's this huge gap between, the different types of jurisdictions and how long we may have to wait. These statistics as well is a ideal case, which means the opponents are not trying to delay or ensure that the process, slows down. So this is in an ideal situation where the opponent plays ball. Let's look at certain circumstances that we may have to do if the opponent does not play ball or if we have difficulty. For example, the previous slide, we looked at substituted service. So if we can't serve on the owner, understand that we may have to add 60 extra days to the application process or to the process in order for us to get a judgment. From a notice of bar, we're looking at about 8 days that we add. But again, you guys can have a look at the inherited file statistics. It's shocking to say the least. And it just underscores the importance of really actively managing the affairs of the attorneys. An application to compel documents. So the opponents opposed, and at some point, they failed to deliver some sort of documents. Once again, if it's unopposed, we're looking at about 60 days per document. There's a few documents that we may have to compel. So that's why I said per document. And from an opposed perspective, 180 days that we can look at to compel each and every document that we need to compel. And then in certain circumstances, a judgment by default is also referred to open court. So what that in effect means is normally a registrar is entitled to grant default judgment. So that is the court's secretary, basically, for lack of a better word. But sometimes those registrars feel that they can't issue the judgment. It may not be something that's wrong with the matter itself. We've seen a lack of inconsistency when it comes to these types of decisions, but then they make the decision to refer the matter to open court, and that also lumps another 60 days onto those dates as mentioned above. So clearly, as I said, it's quite a cumbersome thing to suggest, it can't happen overnight. A lot of people are of the view that it can be quickly. Understand that it does take time, but it does not have to be unreasonable. So that's why look at the gold periods, look at the black periods, and you can clearly see there's a huge difference. So it can become quite the problem. Then I think another important talking point for us is making a wise forum selection. So obviously from a forum perspective, we've got CSOS, we've got the Magistrates Court, and we've got the High Court. So we need to understand the differences, the pros, the cons. Unfortunately, not one of the forums, in my opinion, is perfect, but we need to look at the different ones so that we can decide what needs to happen. From CSOS's perspective, it is cost effective. I don't think anyone can tell you it's going to cost you more in legal fees to go to CSOS. So these ones are important for those schemes that are severely cash strapped. They cannot have a situation where, there is an instance that they need to pay legal fees. So then it's an important and good method to use. It can incur significant delays. What we've heard from our clients is it does take longer, but something that is also important that I need to mention to everyone is CSOS is currently expanding the number of adjudicators that they have, and we have it on good authority that the caseload per month has increased from 500 matters or 500 judgments or adjudications given to 1,400 at this stage. So we sincerely hope in future, that we can say it's cost and time effective, but unfortunately only time will tell. Then interesting judgments and orders. Sometimes we get a lot of interesting judgments, and what I mean with this is judgments where it's ordered that interest needs to be removed even though interest was lawfully raised, or that an owner, his levy account is not allowed to reach interest, or that interest can be raised against them for the period that they need to pay off. Sometimes we get 24-month payment, judgments where the person has quite some time to pay it off. So there is sometimes these interesting judgments that we can also get from CSOS, which may not always be in the best interest of the community scheme. Then limited scope for collection matters. So later on, we're going to look at termination of electricity, emolument attachments, garnishee orders, liquidations, these types of things. So from CSOS's perspective, they can only grant a monetary judgment when we look at collection matters. So they can't order that you terminate electricity or these types of things. So there's a bit of a limited scope. Then when we look at enforcement of orders, again, sometimes it takes time to get the enforcement orders, and we've also seen enforcement orders where it's of such a nature that when we enforce this order and make it a magistrate or high court order, that it's difficult for us to take the process further because the judgment does not really make sense. For example, with these repayment judgments that we've seen, then it's difficult for the registrar or the clerk of the court to issue a warrant on it. So sometimes the enforcement of the orders can also become difficult and hinder the process. And then something that is also important to understand, the court must still be approached for execution of the judgment date. So CSOS takes the matter to monetary judgment and no further. If we want to issue a warrant and get the sheriff to attach movable property or any further legal step that we want to take to try and execute on the judgment, CSOS no longer is the forum that we'll deal with, and we will inevitably have to go to the courts in order to execute on those judgments. Then we get to the High Court and the Magistrates Court. So from a High Court perspective, there's no minimum and maximum jurisdiction. So you can claim any amount from the High Court. They have court online, as I've mentioned earlier. Sometimes it's court offline, or that's a joke that we like to use in the legal profession, where the software is basically buggy. I think a lot of you have also looked at CSOS Connect, and that there's sometimes these types of difficulties. Similarly, court online has difficulties at some points. So I mentioned court online in a good and bad perspective. The bad perspective is when it is court offline, then we struggle to, progress on a matter. But something that's awesome about court online, it's the digitization of a court file. So a lot of the trustees may have seen comments from their attorney saying the court file is lost and we have to apply for a duplicate file or stuff of that nature that the magistrates court face. With court online, we have this digitized court file. We don't lose original documents because you can simply log on to court online and re-download the summons, for example, or re-download the warrant. So you don't lose those documents. And then judges have less sympathy for debtors. So I've seen a lot of positions in magistrates court where if you want to, for example, bring an application to sell the unit in execution, the magistrates may sympathize with the debtor and say maybe we have lesser evils to deal with than trying to address it, where we've seen from high courts, it is a bit less from that perspective. So we get more right from working out of the high court. From a magistrate's court perspective, as I've mentioned, it's a paper-based court files. So therefore, sometimes these court files go missing, and then we have difficulty in progressing with the matter because of the fact that it's paper-based. Magistrates also issue queries. So where in the High Court, the matter gets referred to open court, and one would then have a court date, and you can then apply for your default judgment or whatever in court. We've seen with magistrates where you would get a query from a magistrate from the default judgment, and you would then respond to the query and get a new query and respond to the query and get a new query and respond to the query, which can then in turn also delay the process because we would have to constantly now answer to the magistrate's queries. But something that's important with magistrates courts, it is most definitely less congested than the high courts. I think at this day and at this point, Pretoria High Court is the most congested high court that we can litigate out of. Then execution of judgment. So whether we've followed the CSOS process, whether we've gone through the magistrates court, or whether we've gone through the high court, we have the judgment. The debtor has decided not to pay. The next step is execution of the judgment and the movable property. So this simply means we issue a warrant or a writ where the sheriff then goes to the property or to where we trace the debtor to go and see if there's movable property or cash to the satisfaction of the judgment debt. Then we get to nulla bona returns. I think it's a term that a lot of attorneys throw around. What a nulla bona return in essence means is the magistrate, the sheriff went to the debtor and the debtor has certified that he or she does not have enough assets to satisfy the judgment debt, which means the sheriff is incapable of executing on the warrant and the sheriff then issues a nulla bona return. The next step when we look at these types of processes is then an application to sell the property. So things that are interesting with this is we need to understand the difference between primary and non-primary residence. So obviously a primary residence is where the debtor resides in the property. We have two different set of court rules that addresses these things. So when we look at the High Court for non-primary residences, we're looking at Rule 46. For primary residences, we're looking at Rule 46A. Similarly, in the Maj Court, it's Rule 43 for non-primary and Rule 43A for primary residences. So the biggest difference between these two applications is because of the fact that the owner stays or resides in that property, we also have to give effect to the person's individual or constitutional right to adequate housing. So there's a lot more measures that is in place so that we protect this debtor's interests. The court also frequently then orders a reserve price if it's a primary resident, where they then decide what is the price that that unit needs to sell for at auction. So what are the requirements to be successful with an immovable property or application to sell the immovable property? Most importantly, firstly, you would need a monetary judgment. That would be the first logical step. Secondly, you would have had to try and attempt to execute on the judgment by way of movable property or otherwise, and you should have been unsuccessful with that. Then there's a lot of considerations pertaining to the property value, in order for the court to look at issues such as the reserve price, where the property is bonded. Again, we need to notify the court of all of the debt pertaining to that property, including the bondholder or the municipality, so that the court can understand the level of indebtedness of that person. And as I've said, for primary residences, the court will then issue a reserve price. Then when we look at attachment and sale in execution of the property, so this is now the step after the magistrate or the judge has ordered that the unit can be sold on auction, then the sheriff needs to do a lot of things. So to understand the sheriff's role in a sale in execution, they must firstly go and note an interdict at the deeds office. So they need to go and deliver a document to the deeds office to tell the deeds office, listen, we are now going to attach this property. They need to notify the bondholders. They need to notify the municipality. If it is a repossession from a bank's perspective, they will also have to notify the body corporate, and then they need to notify the debtor of the sale in execution. When we look at a sale in execution, the best case scenario from date of getting the order to sell the unit in auction to getting to the auction, the best case scenario, as I've mentioned, is probably around 3 to 4 months. Anything less than that, you cannot have it, because we have statutory timelines and we need to then deliver certain documents by certain times in order to lawfully convene these types of sale and executions. Then creative litigation strategy. So something that I like to convey in trainings is we also need to sometimes understand the difference between symptom management and cures. So applications to terminate electricity, for example, I think that's a good example of symptom management, which simply means we will get a judgment to terminate, but in 6-7 months' time, when that owner has paid up, it was simply dealing with the symptom as opposed to curing the issues. So sometimes, and as sad as it's to say, but sometimes we do have bad apples in a tree, and we have to, when we look out for the cash flow, and the health of a community scheme. Sometimes we have to pluck the bad apple from the tree to ensure that we get a paying and compliant apple in. So something on the front of termination and suspension and limitation of privileges. We've heard the termination of electricity applications, but understand it can actually go much further than that. You can terminate the electricity supply, you can limit the water supply, and you can also look at the suspension of privileges. For example, you look at termination of gate access or intercom systems. You can suspend the gardening services, and a lot more. But we need to understand when we look at these types of things, it is an application. If we don't have a court order to deal with this, it will amount to spoliation. Then something that I like to instill as well is avoid gambling with uncertainties. So a lot of remedies that we have at our disposal deals with uncertainties that is either not in our knowledge as a community scheme, or we cannot anticipate those types of things. So for example, a financial inquiry or section 65 proceedings, which attorneys like to say, I like to sum it up as a court mandated budgeting process. So we will get this data before a magistrate or a judge, where the magistrate will then look at the person's income, the expenditure. They'll apply a formula and they will say, this amount you need to pay towards your debt. The unfortunate reality is we've seen matters where it's gone on section 65 and where the court now made an order, debtor A must pay 50 Rand towards the arrears, and it is what it is. And the problem with that is, for as long as that owner complies with that type of judgment, there's nothing really that we can do except for looking at varying or doing a rescission or abandoning judgment, these types of things. So sometimes, because of the fact that we don't have insight into a particular person's finances, that is an uncertainty that we will have to deal with if we look at financial inquiries. Emolument, attachment, and garnishee orders. So I always think of the E of emolument as employer. So emolument attachments is where we bring an application to attach part of a person's salary, or garnishee orders is where we bring an application to attach income of another person, which can include rental attachments as well. Again, with these types of things, again, there's a lot of uncertainties. We don't know what the person earns, and we are now gambling, hoping for a good outcome, even though there's a lot of uncertainties. When we look at rental application attachments, we also need to understand that it's not a judgment in perpetuity, in the sense of this tenant and all of his next tenants and their next tenants and next tenants have to pay in terms of that rental attachment. It's only pertaining to a specific tenant. We also see that the relationship between the landlord, who is the owner now, and the debtor, and the tenant very quickly sours the moment that the body corporate starts attaching that rental income, which means the landlord can then, terminate the lease agreement or refuse to renew the lease agreement or give the owner or the tenant notice to vacate. And the moment that person vacates, there's nothing really we can do with that garnishee or rental attachment order. We'll have to start the whole process afresh with the next tenant. So again, a lot of uncertainties. We don't really know what needs to happen or what is the outcome going to be. Then insolvency proceedings. From this perspective, what we need to understand, the moment we sequestrate a person or liquidate the company, all of the creditors and debt basically gets called up. So it's not just the community scheme that's going to be in the queue trying to collect their funds. It is going to be all of the creditors of that person or entity's estate that will form part of a group of creditors. There's a lot of meetings, there's advertising requirements, it takes time, and a lot of times in insolvency proceedings, we look at a situation where it is a cent value in the rand that we get for our debt. So we tangle a person's estate and overcomplicate certain circumstances when we look at insolvency, oftentimes insolvency is not applicable. It's really in exceptional circumstances that we would look at it, but just understand that all of these types of remedies have a lot of uncertainties that we cannot anticipate if we walk that road. Then something that's also important, and it's a bit more general advice than legal advice or insight into the legal process, knowing when to pull the plug, arrears versus reality. If the arrears exceed the property value, what are the realistic prospects of collections in full? I see it a lot where scheme executives are adamant on raising interest each and every month. For the purposes of this example, let's say a property is worth 400,000 and at this point the arrears is at 10 million, and each and every month the scheme executives continue to insist we need to raise extra interest, we need to raise the interest. You need to understand that although for most part community schemes are exempted from tax, issues such as fines, interest, and so forth is actually part of a community scheme's taxable income. So what we're doing at that point, if we're raising interest in perpetuity, we know firstly we will not be able to collect those amounts. We always say the maximum that we can look at collecting is most probably the value in the property itself. So we're continuing to raise interest that we don't get paid or that doesn't get paid during the financial year. Yet at the end of the year, we get a bill from SARS to pay that tax. And we need to understand as well that from a tax perspective, it's deemed income. It is not income in the bank that we get taxed on. You get taxed on deemed income. So we're writing all of these lovely interest checks, for lack of a better word, and ultimately all we're doing is creating a bigger cash flow issue, because at the end of the financial year, the taxman also comes for their stipend. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Do you have any questions for me, Karin?
Dylan, there are a number of questions. Let's just try. Dave, you had your hand up, so often the bandwidth is problematic. Just see if you can unmute and ask your question. Otherwise, Q&A is a better way to ask questions as well, please. Dave, are you going to ask a question? Dylan, maybe just talk to, when you receive an incomplete file, presumably you review it for all of the documentation you need to be able to collect effectively. So, double checking the interest resolutions, the handover resolutions, approval of the budgets, etc. In terms of handovers, the stats you track, how many of the files do you get are complete, how many are incomplete, and what do you do if the documentation doesn't exist because of historical challenges, whether it was handovers from one managing agent to another, or resolutions weren't passed correctly at the right time?
So firstly, we like to take the 14-day grace period to do an in-depth audit of the process. So obviously we don't want to wait per se. So sending a letter of demand, for example, with a statement that has a brought forward balance is not necessarily, a situation where we can't get judgment. So then we'll take that 14 days and use it to our benefit, let it run parallel. We would then advise. From a statistics point of view, I would say about 60%, and it's just me shooting from the hip, I would say is incomplete handovers. More often than not, we get handovers where we have to ask for additional documents. And then from a perspective of if those documents don't exist, or, what is the recourse that we have, it's difficult to say. So it depends on the situation. If you have a AGM pack where the meeting wasn't quorate and we've approved the budget, but there was no quorum, I don't think any attorney is going to be able to work their magic to try and validate that. But then it's mitigation strategy. So for the purposes of that example, then we tell the trustees, we will have difficulty in enforcing this budget. It doesn't mean you don't need to pay levies. It simply means we'll have to fall back on the previous budget that was duly, prepared and duly approved. So it all depends on the situation pertaining to that. If it's a matter of we've raised interest, but we don't have an interest resolution, then we look at crediting amounts so that when we institute the summons, that we actually, that the proper amounts get claimed and we manage the client's expectations. So we don't want to, write a check. Yes, we're going to be able to, get the judgment for this huge amount when we know we can't. So then we notify the client and say, these are the risks. And if you're comfortable with the risks and you want us to proceed, that's a different thing. But we need to, I feel as attorneys, we do have the obligation to notify you of the shortcomings in your matter. And then you need to decide whether you are comfortable with it. Do you wish to mitigate it? Do you wish to continue as is? So those are the types of things that we will look at when determining it. I hope I answered your question, Andrew.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's an important one, and it's, it's part of the managing agent's role to try and assemble a complete handover file to make it as easy and efficient as possible for the attorneys to proceed with legal collections. Dylan, an interesting creative. Karine, go for it.
Sorry. No, I just wanted to say there's a question on the Q&A. Dylan, is it only the tenant that's renting in the property that is central to the dispute, or could we attach another paying tenant should the owner have more than one rental property?
So from a garnishee order perspective, you can attach any right to income. So for example, if a person even generates interest from his own bank account, you can attach it. So it's not central to the person who resides in that particular unit. It can be any form of income. And if he may have, 2 properties, 2 tenants giving him income, you can apply for both.
And how do you discover that, Dylan? So how would you know that somebody's got multiple tenants?
So that's, again, one of the uncertainties and the difficulties. So I've seen specifically where schemes have conduct rules and management rules built in, where they ask for these lease agreements, but we won't be able to. If we don't have a tenant that comes forward and says, this is the lease agreement, then more often than not, we don't really have this information, which again speaks to that gambling with uncertainties, point that I've tried to make with these types of remedies.
Yeah. And Dylan, just speak to an investor that's got multiple properties and pursuing other properties beyond the one that's in question with the rear levies.
So yeah, you can. So from a Rule 46 perspective, if one has more properties, obviously you'll start with one. If you can't satisfy the judgment, that you can ask for more. We've had Rule 46s where the debt was of such a nature that we could ask to execute on more than one property, because when you look at the math, what they owe is more than what we would be able to get. So you can execute on more than one. It all just depends on the type of judgment that you're looking at, the type of value of those properties, to determine whether a judge will say, yes, sell 7 properties as opposed to just one. So that's just I think it will depend on the homework and the facts. But yeah, you can definitely attach more.
Dylan, won't you talk about legal fees? So there's an interesting question here that legal fees need to be separated from the arrear levy account, and typically can only be collected after taxation. So that requires the managing agent to be able to generate a account reconciliation excluding legal fees for the collection, and then legal fees technically should be added after judgment and taxation. Can you just talk about when and how the legal fees can be collected? Because obviously the body corporate is now paying them, throughout this whole long process, which is where, cash flow difficulties can compound very quickly, where the body corporate's not receiving levy income that was budgeted to cover costs. Now they've got extra unanticipated legal fees on top of that, which can put severe pressure on service delivery.
Yeah, so I think the starting point would be, making the separation between an HOA and a body corporate. When we look at an HOA, the documents can allow for different types of things. So I've seen HOA documents more often than not. It says attorney and client does not need to be taxed. those types of things can be added on the statement if the governing documents are phrased correctly. From a body corporate perspective, as you've mentioned, I think you've hit the nail on the head with the separate accounts. If the conduct rules do not allow for it, what we've had, we were fortunate enough to represent a body corporate in Johannesburg, where we obtained a reportable judgment that said if we have rules in the conduct rules that speak to a particular attorney and client basis, for example, and we've incurred that debt, then we can add it to the statement without it being taxed or agreed. But from the perspective of let's accept that the conduct rules don't have those types of provisions, then you're quite right, and we have to look at the duality. We have to look at taxing it, and the moment we've taxed it, we can add it to the levy statement and enforce it.
Dylan, can you just talk about second and third actions? So very often as this whole prolonged process proceeds, there are more arrears accumulating month by month, and that can be, after the summons has been issued. So just talk about parallel legal actions and how you handle those.
So firstly, I think, when looking at second, third, and further handover, so it's one unit and a lot of handovers, it is a very dangerous realm to walk into. I see a lot of clients at month 3. So let's say we've received the handover in January. In April, I'm telling you, we need to institute new action for the next 3 months and do this. It can become a cash flow issue. Obviously it makes sense. If I have 10 matters running on one unit, I've got 10 times the legal cost that I'm going to run up for the body corporate. So we always say, you need to make sure that it makes sense to issue a second action. We say when you look at a second action perspective, my opinion is there's 3 reasons why you would do a second or further action. Reason 1 is the claim amount in the first action is paid up. So, there's not really much that we can do if that claim amount is paid up. Then we have to look at a second action. The second one is if the claim amount is insufficient for certain remedies. So let's say it was a handover at the point they owed 10,000 Rand. We will have immense difficulty in trying to convince a magistrate or judge to sell a unit for 10,000 Rand. So from that perspective, if the arrears are now at 60, then we can look at guiding the trustees to say, if we get another judgment, let's institute a second action and look at getting a proper judgment so that we can, follow the necessary routes. And then the third one for me would be the risk of prescription. So where we now tell our clients, listen, there is an inherent risk that if we don't issue a summons, that some of the amounts may prescribe. So those would be the circumstances, but my knee-jerk is we don't need multiple actions for each and every matter. And I feel like attorneys at this day and age try and encourage multiple actions for each and every file where it's oftentimes unnecessary and where it really burdens the community scheme's cash flow from those perspectives. So it's a tightrope that you're walking with multiple collections or multiple actions.
Dylan, is it a fair comment that attorneys are not all equal in terms of, legal levy collections, because you get specialist firms that do this as core business, a core focus, and they're better set up and better equipped with more tailored systems for legal collections of levies? Is that a fair comment?
It's definitely a fair comment. And I think, everyone can see by dealing with community schemes on the day-to-day, it is quite a fairly technical piece of legislation. So we don't just have rules, we have exceptions to the rules and exceptions to the exceptions to the rules. And from that perspective, navigating compliance, firstly, and I mean, that's why we have great MAs like Trafalgar, is quite the task. And exactly the same, attorneys, they have the saying, jack of all trades, master of none. And it's the truth. So you need to have a specialist attorneys, at least specializing in debt collection. Best case scenario is specializing in debt collection and community schemes so that they have an affinity towards court process firstly from the debt collection side and also compliance, because we have to now convey to the magistrates or the judges or the adjudicators that there is compliance with the Act. So if I don't even, understand the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act myself, how am I going to convey that with confidence to a magistrate, judge, or adjudicator?
All right, thanks very much, Dylan. Last comment and question, really, coming to the end of our time. So an interesting question about taking into account bad debt and legal levy arrears in terms of budgeting for a community scheme, and what budget to present and approve at an AGM. So Dylan, I don't know if you've got a comment on that. I would just say that one would need to look at a cash flow forecast in conjunction with a budget, taking into account expected levy arrears based on the trend of legal collections, and adjust the budget and the forecast cash flow accordingly. Do you agree with that, Dylan?
I completely agree. I think, gone are the times where we can just budget for actual expenses. We need to look at cash flow. I'm sorry, we didn't receive money is not going to be enough to keep the lights on when the municipality comes knocking. So we need to treat community schemes as a business. We need to use statistics to our benefit. And I think a cash flow forecast is a necessary and, very important component of an effective and efficient budget.
Great, thank you. Why don't you just bring up the contact details, please? And then we've hit 6 o'clock. So firstly, thank you very much for everyone that attended this evening. I hope you found it informative. It certainly maps out very well the different legal steps, the challenges, the turnaround times, and partly explains, the length and cost of a legal collections process. So Dylan, thank you very much indeed for the presentation, for joining us tonight. Thank you to my colleagues. Many thanks to our guests. We'd appreciate you just popping your comments into the survey if you have time. And otherwise, we look forward to you joining our April webinar, and we'll be sending out our invitation in due course. Have a good evening, and thanks.